Judge Harold Simmons sat behind the tall wooden bench in the courtroom. His face was serious and tired. He had been a judge for over 20 years. People in town knew him as a strict man who rarely showed kindness in his courtroom. Many thought he was fair, but some felt he was quick to judge people, especially those who looked different from him. That morning, the courtroom was quiet, except for the sound of papers rustling and shoes tapping softly on the floor. Judge Simmons looked over the case file in front of him. The case was about a traffic violation, a simple matter on the surface, but something about this case felt different to him. The woman who was called to stand before him was Monique Carter. She was calm and composed as she walked into the courtroom. Monique was in her early 30s, dressed in a neat navy blue suit. Her hair was pulled back tightly and she carried herself with confidence. People often noticed the quiet strength she had, even when faced with difficult situations. Monique looked around the room before focusing on Judge Simmons. She spoke clearly and respectfully as she answered the questions. There was no anger or frustration in her voice. She simply told the truth. The case was about a traffic stop. Monique had been pulled over for running a red light. She had explained to the officer that she believed the light had changed too quickly. She showed the officer video evidence from her car's dash cam. The video showed that the light changed when she was still crossing the line, but the officer still gave her a ticket. Monique hoped that the judge would see the truth in the video. She trusted the court to be fair, but Judge Simmons had already made up his mind. As Monique spoke, the judge's eyes flicked to the clock behind her. He was impatient. He did not want to waste time on what he thought was a small matter. In his mind, this was just another case, another person who did not want to take responsibility. The courtroom felt cold. The bright sunlight outside could not warm the heavy air inside. Monique stood tall but felt a small knot of tension in her stomach. When it was time to give the verdict, Judge Simmons spoke in a low voice. "The evidence shows a violation of traffic laws," he said. "The defendant is fined $500. A murmur ran through the small crowd in the courtroom. $500 was a heavy fine for such a minor offense. Monique's heart sank. She nodded and said quietly, "Yes, Your Honor." After the hearing, Monique gathered her things and left the courtroom. She did not show anger or disappointment. Instead, she held her head high and walked out with grace. Outside the courthouse, a few people whispered about the judge's decision. Some looked sympathetic toward Monique, while others said nothing. Monique knew that this fine was not just about money. It was about respect and fairness. She had seen unfair treatment before. She worked as a federal prosecutor, a job where she fought hard for justice every day. But today, she was on the other side of the bench. She was the one being judged. Judge Simmons watched her leave. He did not say a word. Deep down, he felt a strange mix of emotions. Satisfaction for finishing quickly, but also an unease he could not explain. Later that day, in his quiet office, Judge Simmons sat alone. He stared at the case file again. The video evidence was clear, but the judge's mind ignored it. He told himself that the law was the law. He believed that his job was to keep order, not to question his own feelings. But Monique's calm strength stayed with him. Her clear voice, the way she looked him in the eye. These things made him uncomfortable. It was easier to ignore that feeling than to face it. Meanwhile, Monique walked through the busy streets outside the courthouse. People rushed past her, talking on phones, heading to work or home. She thought about the cases she handled every day, cases where she fought for people who had no voice. She thought about how justice was supposed to be fair for everyone, no matter who they were. She knew this fight was far from over. Today was just one small moment. But Monique was determined. She would not let one unfair fine stop her from doing her job or living her life. That evening, she sat at her kitchen table, the fine notice in front of her. She could pay the money, but she also knew she had to do more. She decided to speak to her friends and colleagues about what happened. Maybe they could find a way to make the system better. Her phone buzzed. A message from a close friend read, "Stay strong, Monique. We're with you." She smiled softly and replied, "Thank you. We'll make things right." Back at the courthouse, Judge Simmons sat in the dark, thinking about the day. He wondered if he had been fair. For the first time in many years, a question stayed with him all night. What if he had been wrong? The story was just beginning. The next morning, the courthouse buzzed with its usual activity. Lawyers hurried in and out of rooms, clerks shuffled papers, and the murmurs of quiet conversations filled the halls. Judge Harold Simmons arrived early, ready to start a full day of cases. He did not expect anything unusual, just the routine work he had done for decades. But today, something changed. Before his first case began, a group of people gathered near the courthouse steps. They carried signs and wore shirts with messages about fairness and justice. Among them were Monique's friends and colleagues. They had heard about the fine she had received the day before, and they were upset. One of Monique's closest friends, Lisa, held a sign that read, "Justice for all, not just some." Lisa was a lawyer herself, passionate about fighting inequality in the legal system. She looked determined. "Monique deserves better," Lisa said to the group. "This is not just about a traffic ticket. It's about respect. It's about bias that still lives in our courts." The crowd nodded, their voices low but filled with purpose. They wanted the judge to hear their message. Inside the courthouse, Judge Simmons was unaware of the growing protest. He sat at his desk, reviewing his schedule. Then his clerk came in with a message. "Your Honor, there's a group outside. They want to speak with you about the recent case involving Ms. Carter." Judge Simmons frowned. "Tell them I'm busy. I have a full day of hearings." The clerk hesitated but nodded. She left the room quietly. Still, Judge Simmons could not shake the feeling that something was different today. The day's first case began, but his mind drifted back to Monique Carter. Later that morning, a senior court official approached the judge. "There is growing concern about the ruling on Ms. Carter's case," she said gently. "Some people believe the fine was unfair. They want us to review it." Judge Simmons felt a mix of irritation and surprise. "Unfair? The law is clear. The fine is within the limits." "Yes, Your Honor. But the community feels there is bias involved. They are asking for a fair hearing." Judge Simmons sighed. He had always believed the law was blind, but now he could not ignore the voices outside his courtroom. Meanwhile, Monique was at work in the federal prosecutor's office. She sat at her desk, surrounded by stacks of files and papers. Her phone rang. "Monique," the courthouse called, said her assistant. "They want you to come in and talk with Judge Simmons." Monique paused. "Tell them I'll be there in an hour." She stood up, grabbed her coat, and left the office. On her way, she thought about the fine and the protest outside the courthouse. She did not want to make a scene. She only wanted justice. When she arrived, the judge's assistant led her to a small conference room near the courtroom. Judge Simmons was already there, waiting. Monique noticed the surprise in his eyes. For the first time, the judge seemed uncertain. "Ms. Carter," he began, "I understand there has been some concern about the ruling yesterday." "Yes, Your Honor," Monique replied calmly. "I believe the fine was unfair considering the evidence." Judge Simmons nodded slowly. "I want to hear your side, but I must also follow the law." Monique spoke clearly and respectfully. She explained how the dashcam video showed that she had not run the red light unfairly. She talked about the importance of fairness in the legal system, especially for people who have faced discrimination. The judge listened quietly. He could feel the weight of her words. After she finished, there was a long silence. "Ms. Carter," Judge Simmons said finally, "I want to be honest. I did not know you were a federal prosecutor. If I had, perhaps I would have looked at your case more carefully." Monique's eyes met his. Your position requires fairness to all, regardless of who they are or what they do. That is what justice means. Judge Simmons nodded slowly. You're right. I'm beginning to understand that. The conversation marked a turning point. For the first time, Judge Simmons faced the reality that his personal biases might have affected his judgment. He felt a mixture of shame and a desire to change. Outside, the crowd waiting in the courthouse steps grew larger. News had spread about Monique's visit to the judge. Some people cheered quietly, hoping this meant a new chapter. Monique left the courthouse with a sense of cautious hope. She knew the fight for fairness was not over. But today, she had spoken her truth. Judge Simmons returned to his chambers, deep in thought. The law was more than rules and punishments. It was about people, fairness, and respect. He realized he had to look inside himself to be the judge he wanted to be. That night, Judge Simmons stayed late in his office. He pulled out books about justice and fairness. He read stories about people who fought against prejudice. For the first time in years, he felt a real desire to change. At home, Monique sat with her family. She shared what had happened at the courthouse. They talked about how important it was to stand up for what was right. Her younger brother looked up to her with pride. "You're strong, Monique," he said. "Keep fighting." She smiled and squeezed his hand. "I will. For all of us." The day had started like any other, but it ended with new questions and new hope. Both Monique and Judge Simmons knew the path ahead would be difficult, but they also knew it was a path worth taking. The story was moving forward, one step at a time. The days after Monique's visit to Judge Simmons passed quickly, but the tension in the courthouse grew. News of the protest and the judge's private meeting with Monique spread through the halls like wildfire. People whispered in corners, and the atmosphere was different, charged with expectation and uncertainty. Judge Simmons tried to focus on his work, but the weight of what had happened pressed on his mind. He was a man used to control and certainty, yet now he felt unsettled. For years he had believed that his judgments were fair and just, but Monique's words had opened a door he could not close. Meanwhile, Monique went back to her job as a federal prosecutor, but the memory of the fine and the judge's reaction stayed with her. She felt the eyes of her colleagues on her. Some gave silent support, others seemed uncomfortable. It was clear that her experience had sparked conversations about fairness and justice beyond the courtroom. One afternoon, Monique met with Lisa and several other friends in a small cafe near the courthouse. The group had been planning ways to address bias in the legal system. Their goal was to create awareness and change how people were treated in court. "We can't let this go," Lisa said firmly. "What happened to you is not just your story. It is a sign of a bigger problem." Monique nodded. "I agree, but it has to be done carefully. We need to work with the system, not against it." Another friend, Marcus, added, "Maybe we can start with education. Judges and lawyers need to understand their own biases." The group talked late into the evening, sharing ideas and hopes. For Monique, the meeting was a reminder that she was not alone. Many people wanted change, and together, they could make a difference. Back in the courthouse, Judge Simmons faced growing pressure. Some lawyers and court staff began asking questions about his past rulings. Had bias affected more cases than just Monique's? The judge felt the walls closing in. One morning, a young assistant approached him carefully. "Your Honor, the courthouse. Committee wants to meet with you about the concerns raised." Judge Simmons sighed. "Very well, I will attend." The meeting was tense. Members of the committee spoke frankly about the need for fairness and the importance of trust in the justice system. Judge Simmons listened, sometimes defensively, but mostly thoughtfully. "You have a chance to lead change," one committee member said. "People are watching." After the meeting, Judge Simmons returned to his chambers, feeling the weight of responsibility more heavily than ever before. At the same time, Monique received messages of support from the community and her colleagues. A local newspaper asked her to speak about her experience and the larger issue of bias in the legal system. She agreed. At the interview, Monique spoke calmly and clearly. "Justice should be blind," she said. "But sometimes it sees color first. We need to change that." Her words reached many ears, and the story sparked discussions in offices, homes, and schools across the city. Judge Simmons read the article with mixed feelings. He knew the truth of her statement, but it stung to hear it so publicly. One evening, the judge sat alone in his home, thinking deeply. He remembered his own upbringing, a small town, limited exposure to people different from him. He wondered how much that had shaped his views. Determined to understand, he began to read books and articles about bias and justice. He watched videos of talks by experts on race and law. Each new idea challenged him. But change was not easy. One day in court, a young black man came before Judge Simmons for a minor offense. The man's hands trembled as he spoke. Judge Simmons saw fear and respect in his eyes, emotions he had rarely noticed before. For a moment, the judge hesitated. He thought about Monique, her strength and dignity. He thought about his own journey. The case went differently than usual. Judge Simmons spoke kindly and explained the process clearly. He reduced the fine, offering a chance for community service instead. The man thanked him quietly, a small smile on his face. Outside the courtroom, some lawyers noticed the change. They whispered among themselves. Some were hopeful, others skeptical. Monique heard about the case and felt a flicker of hope. She knew one case would not fix the system, but it was a start. The tension in the courthouse remained, but it was now mixed with a sense of possibility. Change was slow and difficult, but it was happening. At a community meeting organized by Monique and her friends, people shared stories of unfair treatment and hope for the future. Judge Simmons surprised many by attending. He stood quietly at the back, listening. After the meeting, Monique approached him. "Thank you for coming," she said softly. Judge Simmons nodded. "I have much to learn, Ms. Carter, but I want to try." Their eyes met, and for the first time, there was a true connection, not just of roles, but of shared purpose. The journey toward justice was far from over, but the first steps were taken. Days turned into weeks since Judge Simmons and Monique Carter had their meeting. The courthouse was still buzzing with conversations about fairness and change, but the tension had shifted. Now, there was hope mixed with uncertainty. Judge Simmons found himself thinking about Monique more often. He was surprised by how much his meeting with her had affected him. Her calm and clear voice, the way she had stood firm in the face of injustice, it stayed with him. For the first time in years, he questioned his own beliefs and decisions. One morning, as Judge Simmons prepared for his day, his assistant handed him a note. It was an invitation to a high-profile event, a citywide legal conference held at a nearby hotel. The invitation was official and included the names of many important people in the city's legal system. Judge Simmons frowned. He had always avoided such gatherings. They meant socializing, small talk, and public appearances, things he didn't care much for. But this time, something made him pause. The invitation included a special session on justice and equality in the modern courtroom, featuring speakers who had fought bias in the law. He decided to go. The hotel ballroom was large and filled with people dressed in suits and dresses. Judges, lawyers, and city officials mingled and exchanged greetings. Judge Simmons felt out of place but determined. He wanted to learn. As the session began, speakers talked about fairness, the power of the law, and the need to confront personal biases. One speaker, a young woman prosecutor, caught his attention. She spoke with passion about the challenges she faced and the importance of justice for all people. When the session ended, Judge Simmons was surprised to find the young woman approaching him. She smiled warmly. "Judge Simmons, it's an honor to meet you," she said. "I'm Monique Carter." The judge blinked. He had known she was a prosecutor, but meeting her here, outside the courtroom, made her presence even stronger. "Miss Carter," he said carefully, "I did not expect to see you here." Monique smiled. "I come to learn, too." Change starts with understanding. They talked quietly, away from the crowd. Monique shared stories from her work, the struggles and victories. Judge Simmons listened closely. He realized she was not just someone to judge. She was a person with deep commitment and courage. The conversation shifted the judge's view even more. He saw the law not just as rules to enforce, but as a tool to protect people and build trust. As the day went on, Judge Simmons attended more talks. He met people from different backgrounds who shared their experiences. Some told stories of discrimination and pain. Others spoke of hope and progress. By the end of the conference, the judge felt both overwhelmed and inspired. He wanted to do better, not only in his courtroom, but in the whole legal system. Back at the courthouse, things began to change slowly. Judge Simmons made an effort to listen more carefully during cases. He asked questions and gave people a chance to explain themselves fully. When he saw fear or confusion in defendants, he tried to ease their worries. Monique noticed the changes. She was still focused on her work, prosecuting important cases, but she kept an eye on the courthouse. She knew that true change would take time. One afternoon, a new case came before Judge Simmons. This time, it was a case involving a young black man accused of a small crime. The man looked nervous, but he answered the judge's questions honestly. Judge Simmons paused before making his decision. He thought about all he had learned, about fairness, about respect, and about the power of the law to heal or hurt. Finally, he ruled with kindness. He offered the young man an option to attend a rehabilitation program instead of paying a heavy fine or going to jail. The courtroom was silent, but some lawyers exchanged surprised glances. They saw a different judge that day, one who was learning and growing. Monique heard about the ruling and felt hopeful. She knew it was just a small step, but it was the right one. At the same time, the city's legal community began talking more openly about bias and fairness. Groups organized, workshops and training sessions. People shared their stories and listened to others. The conversations were not easy, but they were necessary. Judge Simmons found himself volunteering to lead some of these sessions. He spoke honestly about his mistakes and his desire to improve. His honesty earned respect, even from those who had doubted him before. One evening, after a long day, Monique and Judge Simmons met again, this time at a community event focused on justice reform. The room was filled with people eager to make a difference. Monique approached the judge and smiled. "You've come a long way." Judge Simmons returned the smile a bit shyly. "I have much further to go." They stood together as speakers shared their plans for change. The judge felt a deep sense of responsibility, but also hope. He knew that change was not quick or easy, but it was possible. For Monique, seeing Judge Simmons willing to listen and learn was a sign that the system could grow stronger. She thought about the long road ahead, but she felt ready to walk it. That night, Judge Simmons sat at his desk, writing notes about the cases he had handled and the lessons he had learned. He planned to speak more openly about fairness and to encourage others to do the same. The judge's phone buzzed with a message from Monique. "Thank you for listening. We can make justice better. Together." He smiled and typed back, "I'm ready to try." The turning point had come, not just for Judge Simmons or Monique, but for the whole community. The road to justice was still long, but now there was a new path forward. The changes in the courthouse were real, but they were slow. Judge Simmons worked hard to show fairness in his decisions. He asked more questions and tried to understand the people before him. Yet, not everyone welcomed this new approach. Some lawyers whispered that the judge was becoming too soft. A few of his colleagues said he was losing control of the courtroom. Judge Simmons heard these things but stayed focused on what he believed was right. Monique saw the judge's efforts and was quietly hopeful. But she also knew that change would bring resistance. People are often afraid of change, especially in a system that had been the same for so long. One morning, Monique was called to a meeting at the prosecutor's office. The room was filled with her colleagues and the atmosphere was serious. They wanted to discuss the recent events, the protest, the judge's meeting with Monique, and the new talks about fairness. "We have to be careful," said one senior prosecutor. "Not everyone agrees with this new direction. Some judges feel threatened." Monique nodded. "I understand, but we have a duty to make sure justice is fair for everyone." The group agreed to form a committee to promote fairness and reduce bias in the courtroom. They planned workshops, training sessions, and community outreach. At the same time, Judge Simmons faced new challenges. During one case, a young woman accused of shoplifting appeared before him. The woman looked frightened and tired. As the trial went on, it became clear that the woman had a difficult life. She struggled with poverty and had no family support. Judge Simmons felt a deep sadness. He remembered the lessons from the conference and his talks with Monique. He offered the woman a chance for counseling and community service instead of jail time. The courtroom was quiet. Some lawyers whispered that the judge was going too far, but others saw the compassion in his decision. After the hearing, the woman thanked Judge Simmons softly. "Thank you, Your Honor. You don't know what this means to me." The judge nodded, feeling a mix of hope and responsibility. Not everyone was happy with these changes. One day, Judge Simmons received a letter from a group of citizens. They complained about what they called leniency and demanded that he return to the old ways of strict punishment. The judge read the letter carefully. It was a reminder that change was never easy and not everyone wanted it. Monique heard about the letter and sent a message to Judge Simmons. "Stay strong. The right path is not always the easy one." Judge Simmons smiled and replied, "Thank you. I need to remember that." Outside the courthouse, community members continued to speak up. Monique and her friends organized a town hall meeting to discuss justice and fairness. The room was filled with people from different backgrounds, young and old, rich and poor. Many shared stories of unfair treatment in the legal system. Some cried. Others spoke with anger or hope. Monique listened carefully. She knew these voices were important. She spoke about the need for fairness and the progress being made. Judge Simmons attended the meeting, standing quietly at the back. Afterward, a woman approached him. "Judge, thank you for listening," she said. "It means a lot." The judge nodded. "I am learning every day." Back at the courthouse, Judge Simmons began working with the committee Monique's office had created. Together, they developed new guidelines for fair treatment and bias awareness. They held workshops where judges and lawyers could learn about their own unconscious biases. The sessions were sometimes difficult, but many found them eye-opening. One day, Judge Simmons stood in front of a group of judges and lawyers, sharing his story, the fine he gave Monique, the meeting that changed him, and the journey toward fairness. His honesty moved many in the room. Some judges nodded thoughtfully, while others looked uncomfortable but listened. The judge's words sparked new conversations. Slowly, attitudes began to shift. Monique continued her work as a prosecutor, balancing the fight for justice with hope for reform. She and Judge Simmons kept in touch, sharing ideas and encouraging each other. One afternoon, Monique received a call from Judge Simmons. "I have a case that reminds me of you," he said. "Would you like to join me in court?" Monique agreed. They met in the courtroom, ready to face the challenges ahead together. The case involved a young man accused of vandalism. The evidence was not clear, and the man looked nervous. Judge Simmons listened carefully to both sides. After hearing Monique's arguments, the judge gave the young man a chance to make amends through community service. Outside the courtroom, Monique smiled. "This is the justice we need." Judge Simmons nodded. "Yes, it is." Though the path was still long and filled. With obstacles, both knew they were making a difference, one case at a time. The changes in the courthouse were noticeable, but the journey was far from over. Judge Simmons continued to push for fairness, yet some people resisted the new way of doing things. In a system built on tradition, change always faces obstacles. 1. Morning, Monique received an urgent call from the prosecutor's office. A difficult case had come up involving a young man named Jamal. Jamal was accused of theft, but the evidence was complicated. The case was gaining attention, and many expected a harsh punishment. Monique reviewed the files carefully. Jamal's background showed he was from a tough neighborhood with few opportunities and many challenges. But Monique saw more than just the accusation. She saw a young man caught in a system that often judged too quickly. She called Judge Simmons to discuss the case. The judge listened, interested but cautious. "This case will test everything we've been working toward," Judge Simmons said. "I want to be fair, but the law must be respected." The day of the hearing arrived. The courtroom was full of people, reporters, lawyers, and community members. The atmosphere was tense. Jamal stood before the judge, nervous but determined. Monique presented her case clearly, explaining the circumstances and arguing for a fair chance. Judge Simmons watched carefully as Jamal spoke. The young man's voice was steady and he showed remorse. The judge thought back to all he had learned. Fairness was not just about following rules blindly. It was about understanding people and their situations. After careful consideration, Judge Simmons ruled in Jamal's favor. Instead of jail time or a heavy fine, he offered Jamal probation and enrollment in a job training program. The courtroom was quiet at first, then many began to nod in approval. Some reporters scribbled notes, sensing a story of hope. Outside, Monique met Jamal's family. They thanked her, tears in their eyes. "This is a new chance for him," his mother said softly. Monique smiled. "He has to work hard, but he will have support." Back in the courthouse, not everyone was happy with the decision. Some lawyers criticized Judge Simmons for being too lenient. Others whispered that Monique was using her influence unfairly. The judge and Monique heard the criticism, but stayed focused. They knew the fight for fairness was a long road. One afternoon, Judge Simmons received a letter from the city's Judicial Review Board. The letter informed him that some complaints had been filed against him, accusing him of bias and improper judgment. The news shook him. He knew these complaints were part of the resistance to change, but it still hurt. Monique visited him that day. She found the judge sitting quietly in his chambers, looking tired. "You're not alone," she said gently. "We have to face this together." Judge Simmons nodded. "I believe in what we're doing, but this is harder than I expected." Monique placed a hand on his shoulder. "Change always is." The Judicial Review Board scheduled a hearing to investigate the complaints. The community watched closely. Some were worried the progress would be undone. At the hearing, Judge Simmons spoke openly. He admitted his past mistakes and explained his efforts to be fair and learn from them. Monique testified, supporting the judge and explaining the importance of fairness in the courtroom. After hours of discussion, the board decided to dismiss the complaints. They recognized Judge Simmons's sincere efforts to improve and encouraged continued training for all judges. The decision was a victory, but also a reminder that the path to justice required courage. Judge Simmons returned to the courthouse with a renewed sense of purpose. He knew the challenges would not end, but he was ready to keep trying. Monique and Judge Simmons continued to work together, strengthening their partnership. They shared ideas, supported each other, and inspired others to believe in change. One evening, after a long day of hearings, Monique and Judge Simmons sat down at a small cafe near the courthouse. "I never thought I would see the day when a judge like you would stand up and fight for fairness," Monique said with a smile. Judge Simmons laughed softly. "I never thought I would be that judge either." They talked about the past, the challenges, and the future. Both knew the work was far from finished, but the journey had already changed them. As the city lights twinkled outside, Monique and Judge Simmons felt a quiet hope. They had faced trials and criticism, but they had also found strength and purpose. The road ahead was still long and uncertain, but they were not afraid. Together, they would keep working for justice, one step at a time. The courthouse had changed. It wasn't perfect, and it never would be. But the walls that once echoed with judgment now whispered of hope. Judge Simmons and Monique Carter had walked a long, difficult path together, one filled with doubt, struggle, and courage. In the months since the judicial review hearing, Judge Simmons had become a quiet leader for fairness. He continued to listen carefully, to weigh every case with new eyes. His decisions showed empathy and respect. Slowly, respect for him grew among colleagues and the community alike. One morning, Monique prepared for an important trial, one that could test everything she and Judge Simmons had worked for. The case involved a young woman named Tara, accused of assault. But as Monique studied the evidence, she found reasons to believe Tara had acted in self-defense. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the trial began. Tara sat nervously, her eyes wide with fear. Monique spoke clearly, showing the judge the truth hidden beneath the surface. Judge Simmons watched closely. He saw Tara's pain, her strength. He remembered his own journey, how he had learned to look beyond the surface, to see people as they really were. After careful listening, Judge Simmons made his ruling. He found Tara not guilty, explaining that justice was about understanding. The whole story, not just the facts. The courtroom fell silent. Then a wave of relief washed over Tara's family. Monique smiled quietly, proud of the fairness they had achieved. Outside, reporters gathered, eager to share the story of a courthouse beginning to heal. The city's people talked about the changes, about hope for a better future. Monique and Judge Simmons walked together, feeling the weight of their journey. They had faced resistance, criticism, and doubt. But they had also found allies, strength, and change. At a community event later that week, Monique spoke about the power of justice to heal and unite. She told the crowd about the long road ahead, but she also shared a message of hope. Judge Simmons stood nearby, listening. When it was his turn to speak, he stepped forward with humility. "I have learned that justice is not a fixed thing," he said. "It grows with us. It asks us to be better, not just as judges or lawyers, but as human beings." The crowd applauded, moved by his honesty. Monique and Judge Simmons had become symbols of change. Their story inspired others to look inside themselves and the system around them. They showed that even deep problems could be faced with courage and care. One afternoon, as the sun set over the city, Monique received a letter. It was from a young student, thanking her for standing up and fighting for fairness. The letter spoke of hope, hope that one day justice would truly be blind. Monique shared the letter with Judge Simmons. They smiled, knowing that their work had touched lives far beyond the courtroom walls. Judge Simmons looked out the window, thinking about the future. He knew that mistakes would happen, and change would continue to be hard. But he also knew that, with people like Monique and the community beside him, justice could grow stronger every day. Together, They had turned a moment of injustice into a movement for fairness. The story of the racist judge who once fined a black woman without knowing her true power had become a story of learning, growth, and hope. And as the city moved forward, the courthouse stood as a place where justice was renewed, one case, one person, one step at a time.